welcome to episode 6 of the Music Minds podcast. I'm Tony Fennell, and joining me as always is my co-host John Stone. How you doing, John?
All right, how you doing, Tony?
Not too bad, Chiefy, not too bad. We got a nice little episode for them tonight. Tonight's episode is called Synch and Swim. And by the way, Synch is spelled S-Y-N-C-H. Oh, we're tricky fellas, John, we are.
How clever.
What a play on words, right? Anyway, well, it's spelled that way because on today's show, we're going to start exploring a very interesting and important part of the music business, synchronization licensing, which happens to be right up your alley, right, John?
Yeah, that's what I do for the day job.
Well, sorry to keep your day going, my brother. But
yeah, this is more fun, believe me.
well, there you go, right? Let me set this up for you. If you or perhaps your band write good songs, you'll want to get your music placed in some form of sync media, ideally film or TV, or the holy grail, advertising. The fact is, sync media has expanded to the point that it touches every part of our daily lives. Once upon a time, TV and movie theaters were the only avenues for getting your fix of audio-visual entertainment. My brother, those days are long gone. And the options for consuming content are nearly limitless and expanding every day. And with all these new avenues come unlimited opportunities for anyone with talent and, of course, good music to be heard. Let's face it, the amount of movies, commercials, video games, and TV shows being produced every single day is huge. And, of course, those productions need music. And here's the big one. They present a real, and I mean a real opportunity for independent artists to gain exposure and to profit from their work. So, John, how does this part of the music business really work? And importantly, can you make some sense of it for our listening audience and me, by the way?
Hey, well, all right. I'll do my best.
Here we go.
So we've talked about this before, Tony. There are three, basically, for the licensing part of the business. And the rights part of the business, there's three pieces. There's the performance, mechanical, and synchronization licensing. So performance is what's handled by organizations like ASCAP and BMI. Yeah, anytime a song is performed publicly, whether it's in a bar or a stadium or on television, in commercials, etc., they will collect a fee for that and then pay out to the writers of that song and the publisher of that song. Mechanical is anytime somebody, like back in the old days when they would release records, that's also a royalty comes from that. It's a very small royalty, about 9.1 cents per unit for a song. So if you're releasing one of your songs as a CD or a download, an MP3, something like that, you can get a mechanical royalty for that. Then the third piece is synchronization. So synchronization, what does that mean? Basically, it is if your music is synchronized to a piece of film or a video or anything like that, that's called synchronization. And it goes way back to when the first talkies came out for films, and they would put music in as the soundtrack of films. So synchronization is the only one of those three parts of licensing that you can actually do directly, and it's pretty much a straightforward free market system. So you can, as much as you can get for it, if you can negotiate a fee, you get your license fee for that, and you can do a direct license from the publisher or from you as the writer yourself.
There's no set fee, right, John? I mean, those are up for negotiations?
Those are always up for negotiation. You're absolutely right. And each media, as they're called, so you're talking about television, film, commercials, video games, mobile, digital, and internet, videos on the internet, that sort of thing. Home video, if anybody's still doing DVDs, I don't know. Also theatrical, live stage. So if your song is used in a theatrical production, Also in museums, if your song is used as part of an exhibit in a museum, corporations will do their private videos. They'll use it. They have to license anything like that. Anything basically where your song is synchronized to a piece of content, a video content, or something live on stage with dramatic context, lines, people speaking lines, dialogue, and such. That is all going to be under the sync licensing piece of the publishing world and also on the master side as well. And you will be able to do that licensing directly. So it's funny because our good friend Dave Stuckert is out in LA right now, and he's actually reached out to me a couple of times with a couple of friends who have had one who actually wants to make a music video of a cover song, and another who has gotten an opportunity to have their song used in a promotion on A&E Network. So they both were reaching out because they had a couple of questions about, well, what kind of clearance does this require and what kind of fee and all that sort of thing. And I realized, there's some real basic terminology. There's basic rights that people don't quite understand. And I think we'll talk about a little bit tonight, Tony, in that. What exactly are you licensing? How are you letting somebody use your music? What control do you have? That sort of thing. And then, as we talked about, what fees can you get a direct payment fee for that particular use? So
it is actually quite confusing. I mean, I've been in this business a long time, and the funny thing is, John, is that as a musician, and this is not a cop out, you're not thinking that way, because if you're coming up with ideas and you're trying to get stuff finished, the last thing on your mind is, now what about the synchronization? Unfortunately, it just, and when you're signed to a major label, you just expect that stuff to be done. You're always, they're holding your hand. Don't worry about it. We're going to get it done. The market is ever changing. Those major labels are dying away, and you need to know this stuff as an artist. And as you say, people are reaching out to you, and that's why we're doing this show. You and I do this show because there is a lot of, and I'll use my term again, that black magic stuff that I just don't understand. And hopefully, these shows are giving people a little bit of a chance to get their head around it. I'll hand it back to you because it is a tough one. If you can sort of break this stuff down, and I will be quiet now and learn as well, John.
No problem. And please ask questions, Tony. That's the most important part, because if you don't know it, you should ask. Otherwise, you can sort of get, you won't get run over in this business. Everybody still has the right. And as I always say, until I've actually signed on the dotted line, I can darn near do whatever I want.
That's right.
You do want to know just some basic stuff. So what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about what kind of rights you would be licensing, what somebody should be coming to you and asking for, and what you should be asking about, what control you can have over how the song is used. Most importantly, and even before we get into that, just what you were talking about, Tony, you want to make sure that all of your rights to your music are secured. So you want to make sure you have all your copyrights in place. Anybody who is a writer on there, you want to make sure everybody's set on how much they're supposed to be getting, and what control and what where they are as far as the copyright of your music, of your composition, and your master recording if you're doing anything directly and independently. So that everybody's on board with that. If somebody else has the right to say, oh, I don't want my song used, or this song that we co-wrote together used like that, you got to lock all that stuff down, because one thing they hate, now I'm talking about music supervisors and rights clearance people, anything like that, one thing they hate is having a song that winds up with a dispute or an issue. That gets you blacklisted, and you'll never get you get your one shot and you blow it.
That's right. And they have every right to do that.
Absolutely, because a lot of these projects are going rapid, especially if you're talking about advertising. A lot of them are going rapid fire. I mean, you need to give them an answer almost that day. And then you may use it, may not. A lot of times with advertising in particular, they're just fishing for how much it's going to cost. And if you're an indie and you have a great song, let's say you just blown up on Spotify and you have it maybe in a couple of little TV shows and such, something on MTV or whatever, where it's identifiable. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. You suddenly get an opportunity for Crest toothpaste, let's just say, wants to use your song. And, they're going to come to you and say, hey, is this available? Are all the rights clearable? They'll want to do it what's called an all-in license, which means they want to clear both the master and the publishing all at once. If you're not, especially if you're doing this independently, they want to know that they just pay you one flat fee that gets them the recording and the master and the copyright underneath, the underlying copyright, all at one time. So you really want to know that all of your rights are secured. Also, for yourself, you want to make sure you're registered with one of the PROs, performing rights organizations here in the United States, ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, etc., because they're going to be the ones that then collect performance income from any time that commercial is aired, any time that film is on TV or a television show airs, or anything is on Netflix or on one of the streaming platforms. They will be able to collect some revenue from that and pay out to you as well. So always make sure, first and foremost, anytime your music is out there in the public, you've got all your rights secured. That is critical to doing anything in this part of the field, so to speak, part of the business.
Let's absolutely, for everybody's sake and mine, and again, I'll be honest about this. This is a part of the business, and I'm a relatively savvy guy, I think, but this is a part of the business that has always escaped me. And most of the times I have this conversation, I've got 15 drinks in me, and I've gone home saying, "What was he drinking?" I think I'm taking it in, and then I go home and I go, "Oh my word, what was all of that?" So, with a clear head. And let's dumb it down for let's dumb it down for me. It sounds like a TV show. Dumb it down for Tony. But if we could absolutely just nice and easily go through the basics of sync licensing. Okay.
Sure. So you've got your song. And you're recording. So we're just going to call it a one piece for our purposes here. Yeah. And somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I love your song. I want to use it in my TV show." Okay, great. So you're going to want to know, what media are they going to be putting that TV show out in? Now, in the old days, it used to literally just be TV. But now you have television, you have internet, you have downloads. They'll be able to download it. You can stream it. You can do all sorts of things. You'll have home video, that sort of thing. So a lot of times, if it's a big TV show like Breaking Bad, something like that, they're going to clear something called all media excluding theatrical. So theatrical means it's not going to be shown in a movie theater. Okay. So you'll basically be giving all the rights for them to perform this television show in any media that they want, excluding in a theater. Sometimes they'll just say excluding theaters where they charge admission for that. So
got it.
I find it interesting because that's a smaller and smaller part of the marketplace, but it's an understood, piece of this. So you'll assume now that it's going to be all media excluding theatrical. How long are they going to want it for? The license term, it's called. Sometimes it's for a short period of time, maybe 1 or 2 years. Most of the time, though, if it's all media excluding theatrical, it'll be perpetuity. So they'll want it for all, the rest of the time that the copyright's in effect and beyond. Territory. Generally, again, with all media excluding theatrical, you'll have a world territory. So you want to make sure that your rights are cleared for all the world. Pretty much they should be as soon as you've copyrighted it and you don't have anybody, who's like from England or something like that. It doesn't even matter if they are, but as long as you've got it copyrighted and it's set, you don't have to worry about it. That's mostly for older music. So your territory is going to be for the world, or sometimes like if it somehow should get on to like American Idol or something like that, they'll have more limited territories, usually US and Canada and stuff. But for our purposes here, it's a world license. Yeah. The description of the use, what are they doing with it? Is it a background vocal? Is somebody actually singing your song on screen? That's a visual vocal, it's called. Or a background vocal is your song and your track are being used in the background of a scene or a segment of a documentary, something like that. Are they using your master recording? Are they going to want to do a new recording? Sometimes that can help move the fee up and down, dependent. So if they are not licensing a master recording, if, say, someone's singing your song on screen, they don't have to license the master, so you can get a little bit more for the publishing if you can work that out. Yeah.
That's cool.
Then there's the description of the use, and that means, is it going to be a visual vocal, a background vocal, instrumental, that sort of thing? If it's a visual vocal, that means it's somebody's actually singing your song or performing your song on screen. If it's a background, that means your master recording and your composition are both being used as sort of background music in the scene. Now, another consideration is if it's going to be an opening credit or closing credit use, that actually can get you a little bit more money because it's more prominent, particularly an opening credit. That usually gets you the most because the old joke is everybody has to watch the opening credits. Everyone doesn't have to watch the end credits. So it's a little bit more money can be gained from that. It's more exposure, obviously, for your song. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can get a little bit more consideration, not necessarily money, so to speak, but you can get some consideration for maybe more exposure, make sure that they, promote your band or your music and such.
Hey, listen, that's worth more than money sometimes. We both know
sometimes that. You're absolutely right. Believe me, they'll use that as leverage when they don't want to pay you money.
Well, Are you saying they, or are you saying you usually use that as leverage, John? No, sorry. I was dumping that on you then.
Me when I'm wearing that hat.
Right.
But when we're looking at it, again, with the catalog I work with, we don't, sometimes we do. Now, we do have a lot more obscure songs, and we're much more willing to let people use them in that type for an in context, or the more exposure of the song, the better, because maybe it'll get it a little bit of a revival or something like that.
Yeah.
Now, out of context, that is a different animal. Now, out of context means they're basically using your song, but they're not using it in the scene that it was used in the actual production. The difference here is it's almost being used as a promotional tool, somewhat like a commercial. So the song maybe now is being associated a little bit more, not necessarily with the use in the show, but it's actually being used to promote the story of the show, or the larger, storyline or essence of the show, so to speak. Again, if you wanted to use Breaking Bad, if somebody was using one of your song in a scene and it was used, that's fine. But if they're now using it to promote the show itself, that is something else. And you can actually ask for more money for that. And sometimes you can get a really pretty penny for that. You'll get more money for the promotional use out of context than you actually get for the use in the show. So always make sure, if you're granting promotional rights, it's in context only, unless they specifically ask for out of context. So then your fee, then they'll almost always tell you, this is what we have as our music budget. This is what we can afford to pay you. It's usually in the low thousands. If you're talking about television, theatrical also usually will be lower. Internet can be very low, depending on what they're wanting to do with it and such. Commercials, you can make more money. Now, you're not going to retire on this, but you can make a decent amount of money off of a commercial, because this is explicitly being used to promote a product or a brand or something like that. So you can definitely get a little bit, definitely more money than the other media, all of the other media beside that. Video games, you're going to get a flat fee. Any kind of home video, it's always very low. Theatrical, you'll oftentimes get a percentage of the actual gross box office on a weekly basis. That's usually also very low. Everything else is always going to be a very low flat fee, and you don't have to worry about that. Now, something called Most Favored Nations that you want to keep track of. Most Favored Nations means basically that whatever everybody else gets paid, I get paid. Now, they usually will offer that if they are dealing with a lot of music in the production and they want to just pay everybody a flat fee. I always actually jokingly refer to it as least favored nations, because you're basically, well, this is all we can pay, but we'll promise we're only paying everybody the same amount. So most favored nations, if you're able to get it, that's great. Like if you did a song with a producer and the producer owns the master recording, but you own the composition, or you had somebody else recorded your song and there's a master owner that is not you, you're not associated with him, and you own the publishing, you always want to make sure Most Favored Nations applies to the master and the publishing, so that you're getting the same.
What's interesting, John, is, again, a lot of that I knew and I kind of understood. I've never, ever heard that term, ever.
Most Favored Nations.
Yeah, is that something that has been implemented in the last 10 years or so, or has it always been there and I just once again wasn't paying attention?
I'm sure it's an older term. I've known it since I've been doing this, and I've been in it, for a while. So I know that it's always been around. It's one of those things, because legally you are not allowed to, and this is actually overall laws, collusion between parties. You're not allowed, a master owner. So if a record label owns the master recording and the publisher owns the publishing, they really are not allowed to talk to each other to set the fee. Because they're not tenants in common. It's a legal term. Yes. Tenants in common means you're both the part of the publishing. Publishers can talk to each other. Sometimes that's frowned upon as well, but they're not legally prohibited from doing that. You're really not supposed to talk to a master owner, because you are two people who own two different pieces of this, and you should be negotiating separately. And what ensures that everybody's getting treated fairly is this concept of most favored nations.
I like it.
So that's what keeps it in place.
It's actually a really good band name as well, isn't it? What's the name of your band, mate? Most Favored Nations. I like it.
Oh, good, yeah. All the songs sound the same.
There you go.
Also here, when you're talking about performance, you're talking about mechanical, you really don't have the right to say yay or nay to somebody performing your song in a bar. You can't stop somebody from performing your song in a public place, or stop somebody from just doing a straight recording, a cover recording of your song to get it, as long as they've gotten a mechanical license. With Synch, you can say yes or no to a use because you have absolute control over your rights, as long as if you're doing it yourself, or if you should negotiate a deal with a publisher or with a record label, you would always want to make sure that you have approval rights. We've talked about this as well, Tony.
Yes.
So you want to make sure that because what they have to do is basically come to you, and you can put into your agreement, if you're doing this through a publisher, that I don't want, if you're, as we talked about before, if you're a vegan, you don't want it associated with any kind of meat or any kind of, products like that. If you're a pacifist, you don't want it associated with promoting war, promoting the army or something like that.
Right,
so you can always have those rights. If you're doing it directly, you can say, well, I would like to know more about the scene, or, what's going on visually, so I know my song's not being used in a way that might affect it negatively for commercial purposes.
Yeah, I remember reading Roseanne Cash, Preparation H, the hemorrhoid cream. They wanted to use Ring of Fire. Do you remember that? They actually, and I thought it was just an urban myth, but it's actually true. They wanted to use Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire for a hemorrhoid cream advert, and Roseanne Cash went, absolutely not. And there it is, right there. You step over the line.
Well, and you'll be surprised. I mean, we have songs when you're like, are you kidding me? It's I won't talk about specifics, but you just look at it and they come to you sincerely. They really do think. Right. And other ones where songs, they know the title of the song, but they really don't know the lyrics. And the lyrics may be totally contrary to the title, but they want to use the song. And you're like, do you understand that song doesn't say what you think it says just by looking at the title, So it's very surprising. And I know you've dealt with this, Tony, doing music for film and television and such. When you deal with creatives, we'll talk about this in a future episode of Synchronization and such, because when you deal with creatives that are visual creatives, sometimes they are, pardon the expression, tone deaf. When it comes to music.
They are brutal. Actually, I got a question for you just before we move on to the next section here.
Sure.
Is there one particular agency that artists can submit their work to? I mean, because I can remember back in the day that as a writer, I was signed to Warner's and I was signed to EMI Publishing, and with those guys, I'd get a tip sheet on who's looking for music, whether it was even for an artist or a TV show. Do those tip sheets still exist for non-signed artists? At the end of this, we'll have more of an understanding of how the sync licensing works. But the bottom line is you've still got to get that music to someone, and we're talking about those creatives that we were just talking about. Those are the guys. We should let our audience understand how to get to those guys at some point.
And absolutely. And there are a couple of different types. The main parties that you want to get to are someone called a music supervisor.
Yep.
Almost every film and every television show has one. A lot of them are now curators of new music, finding new music, looking for new music. Yeah. And that we'll do a subsequent podcast on that, Tony, about music supervisors, the role they take. Actually, a good friend of mine, a guy who I've done some music supervision myself, mostly on the clearance side, but a good buddy of mine, Eric Masson, you know him, of course, as well, Tony.
He's another one. He knows his stuff.
Yep, and so he's done that, and we'll have him on the next podcast to talk about the process of, as a music supervisor, looking for music, listening to it, bringing it to a producer or a filmmaker or a television producer, showrunner, whatever, and saying, okay, what do you want? A lot of times the producer already has music in mind, and boy, you get stuck with something called temp track love, which we'll talk about, which, your music editor throws it in and goes, oh my God, that's so perfect. I'm like, you do understand understand that, that is like a $50,000 song. You're not going to get that.
Wasn't that a soft cell song? Oh no, that was Tainted Love, not Temp Track Love. Sorry, I got the
Temp Track Love. I'm
here all week. Try the veal. Sorry, no. All
there you go.
Yeah, sorry, John. I'm in one of those moods tonight, matey. I apologize.
Perfect. Absolutely. No, I love it.
All right. So moving on.
So you have the right, so just putting a button on this.
Yes.
So you have the right to say yay or nay. You have the right to look and say, I'd like to know more about the scene. I want to make sure it's not being used in any controversial way, anything like that. Now, another piece of this, and we'll talk about it very quickly, networks like MTV, ones that use a lot of music, mostly in their reality shows and such, they'll request something called stems. And stems are basically, they want to get your actual recording session, your digital recording session of this song so that they can strip out and basically use your song in a lot of ways that I particularly do not care for. In many, we had a really wonderful band from Boston that we had did a little bit of work with, and they got one of their songs used on one of these MTV shows, and they had asked for stems. And so basically, they'll just take the drum track and the bass track and maybe the acoustic guitar, no voice, no lead instruments and anything, and they'll just use it as background music. Ouch. So they were really excited about this. Of course, they don't get paid a lot of money because MTV doesn't pay a lot of money. And so I was like, let me watch this. The one time I'll ever watch this show, I don't even remember what it was, but it was awful. And I watched the entire episode and I was like, I think that might have been it. It was like 25 seconds of a guitar strumming. And I was like, I think that might have been it. And I was like, what value did that bring to you? And this is something, and I'll sort of put the end of this is, always make sure the value is being given to you. Even if you're not going to get a lot of money in the license fee, make sure there's value to this in increasing your exposure, bringing this song to a new audience, and then giving that audience an opportunity to get back to you and say, wow, I love that track. What is that song? And, do your social media, get it out to your audience, say, hey, I'm going to be on this, my song's going to be on the show, etc. Do all that due diligence, but see what you can negotiate with the producers and the production company, especially if they're not going to give you a lot of money up front, to say, well, I really want to use this as what can we do together to help promote this? And believe me, they have all kinds of channels and outlets to get their music out there. Maybe at some time down the road, if they really love the song, it's a big deal. They can have you come in and perform on one of the scenes or something. You know what I mean? So it's always good for that. What's
interesting as well, I've seen over the years, there'll be a scene or there'll be an advertisement. As you were saying, like a small commercial for the show, and then they'll have in the bottom of the left hand corner, they'll have the name of the band and the track. So which I think is really good. I mean, it's kind of like the old days in the 80s when I was signed to Atlantic, the albums that they would hand out to the record to radio stations would have "Play It and Say It." Do you remember that, John? Remember that?
Oh, sure.
The whole campaign, and it was this. Basically, it's the same principle. A lot of those radio stations will play seven tracks in a row. Back in the day, you had no clue who those bands were, and I thought it was a really, really, really strong and healthy campaign. Play it and say it. I thought it was fantastic.
Yep, and absolutely. And I believe that little, when they put it in the lower left corner, I think that's called a chyron. Ooh. And it can tell you, who the band is, what the song title is. And these days, that's all you really need, because you can, then Google it, and boom, that should be taking you right to all the platforms and everything that the song's available on. So it'll give you that kind of exposure. But yes, you definitely, whatever you possibly can do. And then just one final thing, when you have your stuff used in a film or a TV show, or anything like that, you can ask, and you should get a cue sheet. Now, a cue sheet is basically a list of all of the songs and all of the music that was used in that episode of the show or in the film.
Very important. Yeah.
Very important, because number one, you can look at that and make sure that you have the right performing rights organization. Your names are correct. If they're using an ISRC code or something like that, that's correct. That's how the performing rights societies can make sure that you're getting paid performance, because that cue sheet gets submitted to them. And then anytime that episode airs or anytime that film is on television or whatnot, they will be able to say, okay, there's a little piece of money that's going to be going to this particular artist or this writer. And to their publishing company if they have a publishing company. So that is always very important to have that and make sure that the information on that is correct and accurate, because that's how you will be able to get some extra money going down the road from that use.
It's a big world out there, John. I mean, when I opened the show tonight, explaining the amount of outlets now that are using music, it really is crazy. I was going to ask you about the sync licensing for live work. Is that really done on the honor system? Because every time I've gone on tour, we list the tracks we played that night, and we send it in. I mean, can you really track that down?
Sure, and what you've actually done is, like, they used to do playlists on the radio, and they had to keep track of all of those because those also got submitted. So that's going to be for direct performance. So those playlists that you've written out, those are going to get submitted probably by the venue to ASCAP or BMI or whoever is the Performing Rights Society that has that music. And then because you were in front of, I'm sure, tens of thousands of people,
those 3 or 4 at the bar were having a great night.
They can weight that, so to speak. Well, the venue itself has a certain weight. They call it, weight as in, like me, I'm too heavy, a weight. You have a weighted system, and the bigger the venue, then the more, more money that they pay to ASCAP, and then that can be brought out when your song has been performed there. And we've had this conversation with a couple of friends of yours, Tony, who don't feel that they're getting the right weight, so to speak, on performances of their music. And that's a whole other animal we'll talk about sometime down the road, the PROs and how they work, especially with the United States organizations, and then all the organizations around the world in Europe and Asia and such, and how they all communicate with each other and exchange funding and all that sort of thing. So I've been doing this 20 years. It is, as you've said, Tony, you learn something new every day, and you're like, wow, how do you do that?
I've just taken an absolute ton on board, and I actually think for the first time, and this is not for the benefit of the show, I feel like I've got an understanding exactly now of what sync licensing actually means. It's the first time ever. Sure. I mean, and as I say, that's not because you haven't told me enough times. It's because I wasn't listening.
Well,
damn those drinks, John. Damn those drinks.
Well, now we got it down, so that people can listen to it again, because it can. And we're always here. So one thing I love to do, and one thing that we're doing this show for, as you said earlier, Tony, is we want to get this information is power as much as anything. Yeah. And so the more you know, I mean, it's a cliche, but the more you know about this, the better position you'll be in to be a good negotiator and a good partner when you're dealing with somebody. Because look, everybody wants this to work. They want to use your song. You want to have your song used. You want to get a fair compensation for it. The more you know, the better off you're going to be. So anything we can do to help with that, we're happy to do.
Dude, it's absolutely brilliant advice. We are at that time, as we always get to. It's time to say bye-bye. But John, as always, mate, you are a fountain of knowledge. I want to thank everybody for listening. You know where to find us, musicmindspodcast.com. Like and subscribe, please. We'll see you next time. John, later.
Thank you. See you then, Tony.